Welcome everyone to tonight's program where we will be discussing Name Arcadia, the first wartime conference of Churchill and Roosevelt, written by John F. Shortal. John Shortal joins us tonight, and thank you very much to our audience and to John. I know there's a lot going on this time of year on an evening, and so we're delighted to have you and appreciate your support and participation in this program. John, you've got a great book out that we're going to talk about shortly, and I want to wish you a very good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, John Shortal is a retired brigadier general in the U.S. Army. He is also a distinguished historian. He was a historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History at Fort McNair, downtown D.C., where I met him and was able to work with him for a couple years. Before he went off to the Joint History Office at the Pentagon, where he also served a number of years. Now retired, he's written this excellent study of the first major conference of World War II with Churchill and Roosevelt and their staffs. And we want to welcome John. So, John, a good evening to you.
Hi, John. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. Glad you're with us. And this is a great book. I think folks will be very happy to read this after hearing about it. And it's really a great study about the immediate beginning of the American involvement in World War II, active participation and collaboration with the British, and really sets the tone for a lot of what happened during the war, this conference. And the first question I want to ask is this in your book, you really kind of start with Pearl Harbor as the impetus for America's reconsideration of their role with helping Great Britain with Lend-Lease, and that maybe that had a change. What was Pearl Harbor's immediate impact on Army planners?
Well, in 1941, the American and British chiefs meet twice, once in February, March 41, and then at the Argentia Conference, Newfoundland, Placentia, in August. But because of the, Roosevelt was in a tight spot with the isolationists, and he couldn't come on too strong in his aid to Great Britain. You know, we did do the Lend-Lease in 1941, but the Americans had to be very careful what they signed up for, what they promised. And they were very quiet in those meetings. Now, at the one in the ABC conference in February, they did agree to the Germany First strategy, that the bulk of our resources would be dedicated to defeating Germany if we had to fight both Germany and Japan. But there was a serious, as I talked about, I don't want to get ahead of you, was a serious disagreement over Far East strategy. And it all centered around Singapore, and it almost ended the conference. And then in August, when they met, the Americans didn't get much notice, the American chiefs going to the conference, and they only met twice with their British counterparts, and they were very quiet. They didn't want to get ahead of the president. They didn't want to say anything that was going to get the isolationists to come down on them. And so the British interpretation, because they were quiet and wouldn't make a commitment, was that they weren't good strategists. Once Pearl Harbor happens, well, then, you know, the handcuffs are off and they can talk about anything. And what happens with Pearl Harbor is Churchill's having dinner with the US ambassador to Great Britain and Averell Harriman, the Lend-Lease coordinator. And they hear on the radio that there has been an attack at Pearl Harbor. So Churchill immediately gets on the phone and he calls Roosevelt, not the phone, but, you know, he calls him, and Roosevelt tells him, you know, it's quite true. They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We're in the same boat now. I'm giving you all the background that leads up to it, but what happens is, you know, everybody talks about it. All the historians talk about it because Churchill writes right after the war. His first emotion is relief. He says, no American will think it wrong of me if I proclaim that to have the United States at our side was my greatest joy. I could not tell the course of future events. I knew the United States was in the war, up to the neck, under the death. The guy could write. So we had won after all. What happens, though, is that's writing after the fact. That euphoria didn't even last 24 hours, because the morning of 8 December, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, calls the senior British air officer in Washington into his office and tells him the B-24 bombers we were going to give you as part of Lend-Lease, you can't have them. We need them to defend the West Coast. And then he walks into a meeting of the Supply Allocation Board, and he tells them American priorities have changed. Now, top precedence is going to equipping U.S. armed forces. And this has a severe impact on Lend-Lease. The bulk of the equipment produced in the United States in 41 was not going to the United States military. It was going to Lend-Lease, to Britain and others. So this really hurts the British. They're counting on this military equipment, tanks, planes, guns. That's what we're talking about, manufactured in this country to fight Germany. And they no longer would have that priority. So Churchill's really upset about that. And then he begins to worry, our newspapers are full of nothing but the war against Japan. And Germany gets no mention. And then he's looking at that and he begins to think the Americans are going to dedicate all their resources to fighting Japan. And he's really seriously worried. So he contacts Roosevelt and he says, I need to come over there right now. And I'll bring my military advisors and we need to have a meeting. And, we need to talk about the war plan in light of new reality and the problems of production and distribution. Roosevelt tries to push him off, but, he says, well, he knows the chiefs are busy. They've just been in a war for 48 hours at this point. They're trying to get aid to the garrisons in the Pacific. The Pacific fleet has been sunk. They're trying to get reinforcements and supplies to the Philippines. And he doesn't, he's trying to give the chiefs, Roosevelt's trying to give the chiefs a break. But Churchill's not listening. And he says, I have to come over and I have to come over right now. So Roosevelt tries a ploy. He says, well, why don't you wait a month? He doesn't like that. Then he says, Roosevelt tells Churchill, well, I'm worried about your safety. Why don't we wait a little bit? Churchill says, no, I have to come now. And then, Roosevelt gives up. He acquiesces. He says, okay, if you've got to come now, you got to come now. And, as you might guess, the American chiefs weren't thrilled that they were hosting a conference 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. And they wanted time to reassess what was going on. The big thing, though, that bothered them was they weren't looking forward to haggling over equipment that was produced in this country. That was a big stumbling block. And they had a lot on their plate, and they just didn't want to argue about that. And so the impetus was Pearl Harbor to have this conference, and that's what happened.
Right. Okay. So one thing you write, John, is that the British chiefs and their staff officers compared to the American chiefs and their senior staff officers, that the British seem to have developed a system where they could all talk to each other and try to plan together. And you make note that the Army and the Navy weren't real good at talking to each other. So what was the reason for that, and how did that affect things?
Well, the British were very organized. You're right. Then they had the Committee of Imperial Defense, which was chaired by the Prime Minister, and it advised the cabinet. And in 1923, they'd established a Chief of Staffs Committee, which allowed the three service chiefs to, it provided them a regular venue where they could meet, discuss issues, prepare plans, provide advice to civilian leaders. And they had planners assigned to subcommittees. And this enabled the military chiefs to review various relevant factors systematically and thoroughly, and then make a consensus-based decision. The British always presented a united front. It was not, it was never the Army said one thing and the Air Force said another. It was always a united front. And, the chiefs and all their principal planners grew up under this system during the interwar years. And, and they were familiar with its place in the decision-making process. Now, the Americans, the Army and Navy worked independently of each other. They had no secretariat to, collect or organize records, and they only very reluctantly shared any information with each other. And so coming in, the British had a united front, and they were all on the same sheet of music, and the Americans, the Army, Navy were hardly on speaking terms. From a coordination point.
So when the Americans and the British started talking to each other, as you started to mention earlier, there was a disagreement over how to handle what Americans and the British call the Far East. And the British were not in a position to have a fleet in the Atlantic and another in the Pacific. So they were really concentrating on Singapore, but the Americans had a different priority. Can you tell us about that and what that argument was about?
Yeah, and because this is what almost ended the conference in February. When World War I ended, Britain was basically bankrupt. And then the abrogation of the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty and the Japanese naval expansion in the Far East created a strategic dilemma for the British. They had to defend the Commonwealth nations, Australia and New Zealand, from any economic or military threat in the Far East, but they couldn't afford two fleets. They couldn't afford to have a fleet in the Pacific and a fleet in the Atlantic. So strategists opted to build a large naval base at Singapore with the promise to Australia and New Zealand that if there was a threat in the Far East, and they would only have one fleet, and that would be in the Atlantic. But if there was a threat in the Far East, they would take that fleet from the Atlantic, and within 70 days, they would have it at the naval base at Singapore to deal with whatever the threat was. And this was their main fleet to Singapore strategy, which is discussed by them. And both New Zealand and Australia took this strategy very seriously. They took this as a promise, a sacred promise. The problem with this strategy is that it's predicated on the assumption that there's stability in Europe. And even before the war, it was obvious that there wasn't going to be stability in the Atlantic, in Europe. So the British lacked the means to fulfill their guarantee to Australia and New Zealand. So how were they going to square this circle? Well, their solution was they wanted to get a commitment from the United States to move a fleet to Singapore. And they argued to the Americans that, well, Singapore is the key to the defense of the Far East, and it's much more important than the Philippines. Well, to the American strategic planners, the Philippines were far more important than Singapore was. And this didn't make any sense to the Americans because they already had a naval base at Pearl Harbor. So they didn't need the naval base at Singapore. So this was a serious bone of contention. And it had almost ended the conference in February. And as Churchill came over, he knew there was a major disagreement between, his planners and our planners over what to do in the Far East. But as he came over, his three primary objectives were: one, to get a commitment from us on the Germany First strategy; two, to get Lend-Lease, back the way it was supposed to be, get access to that military equipment. He wanted it to flow. And then the third thing was, as the industrial might of the United States grew, as we started to mass produce tanks, planes, and guns, he wanted a bigger share of that production.
So before we get into the actual conference itself, can you tell us exactly where was the conference? What was the
Yeah, the
physical
conference was right
nature
here
of
in
it?
Washington, D.C., and in the old public health building. And it was between the 24th of December, 1941, and the 14th of January, 1942. It was 3 weeks long, and the American and British chiefs met 12 times. And it really was one of the most productive conferences of World War II. And it really is the basis of it, established the Anglo-American cooperation, and is the basis of the special relationship.
Good. And how many people? Can you give us a sense of how many people were there for this conference?
The British probably brought 40 or 50 people with them. The head, though, they brought their best people. They brought the head of the Navy, Admiral of the Fleet, Dudley Pound, who had been in the job for 2 years as the head of the Royal Navy. And he was a confidant of Churchill's. Churchill had a lot of respect for him. Probably the smartest chief was the head of the Air Force, Air Marshal Charles Peter Portal. And Portal was another guy. He was young, vigorous, smart, and Churchill really, really respected him. They represented the Navy and the Air Force. Now, it was different who they brought for the Army. To represent the Army at the conference, Churchill brought Field Marshal Sir John Dill. And that's surprising because just days before he had fired Dill as the chief of the Imperial General Staff. They had butted heads all through 1941, and Churchill had, made no bones about it. He fired him. And he was going to go to Bombay to a ceremonial job where he did nothing. And at the last minute, right before, on the 12th of December, they boarded the ship on the 13th. The new chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, goes to Churchill and says, you're making a mistake. You need to bring Dill with you to represent the Army. Brooke had to stay back because you needed one chief in London while the war was going on. And he said, you need to take Dill. And he told him, the Americans respect Dill. They admire Dill. He gets along well with the Americans. You'd be smart if you took him with you. And Churchill did, and it turned out to be really fortuitous. Now, when you look at the memoirs after the war, Marshall said one of the biggest fears he had during the whole war was that Churchill was going to take Dill and pull him back to England. And in the Library of Congress, at the interviews with Admiral King, if you weren't in the Navy, he didn't have anything good to say about anybody, with one exception. He admired Dill tremendously. So the Army and the Navy both thought, the American Army and Navy both thought the world of Dill. And then, Dill dies in November 44. They bury him at Arlington, which is not done. And then they raise an equestrian statue for him at Arlington. And there are only 2 of them in the entire cemetery. So, it was unheard of, the respect and admiration all the Americans had for Dill. And when you read the interviews after the war, every American had nothing but good things to say about Dill. And then the truth is, the British admired Dill because in a lot of those arguments with Churchill, they didn't think he was wrong.
Interesting. So during the conference, you mentioned that eventually both sides agreed on the Germany first strategy, and that there was a grand strategy paper. There was an outline or a guide to the way ahead. Can you tell us what that was and why that was so important?
Sure.
And also, you mentioned that you believe it was the best possible agreement that could be reached just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor.
Right. First, the first day of the conference starts off horribly. It's Christmas Eve. It's the 24th of December. And this becomes a theme in the conference, and I do talk about it. The American Army and Navy do not coordinate with each other. They don't talk to each other. So the planners don't know how many people are coming to the meeting. So they're over at the building. They picked a room that's too small to hold everybody. And while the American and British chiefs, all these 4-stars, are standing around in the hallway, the planners are scurrying around trying to find a room big enough to hold everybody. But once they sort through it and they finally get everybody in the room, the meeting goes pretty well. The opening minutes, as you said, start with the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, who's the senior member of the host nation. He tells the British right away, the opening comments, we support Germany first. Germany's the greatest threat to the United States. We're going to dedicate the bulk of our resources to defeating Germany. So the number one priority for the British coming over to the conference is settled in the opening seconds of the meeting. And, one historian said that that's the most important strategic decision of World War II. Later in that meeting, though, now the British had brought this up before, but the Americans didn't want to say too much because they, political pressure. Now they discuss and they're willing to talk about what's the blueprint? How are we going to defeat Germany? And so they start with a 5-phase strategy. Phase 1 is you got to build up the industrial base. So the United States needs to mass produce tanks, planes, and guns. And then we need to get raw materials to England so that they can continue to produce at a high level. Everybody agrees with that. Second phase is you've got to secure the lines of communication so you can get tanks, planes, guns from the United States to England, to Europe, to the Middle East. And with the U-boat threat going on, you have to secure your lines of communication. So you've got to be able to get this equipment you produce overseas. And everybody agrees to that. Depending on the historian you read, there's somewhere between 200 and 250 German divisions tied down in Russia. So the third phase was it's probably a good idea to keep Russia in the war. So you've got to get aid in equipment, tanks, planes, guns, to Russia to keep them in the war. Everybody agrees to that. Then you need to wear down Germany till you build up, a strong enough force. And you do a strategic bombing campaign, you do a blockade, you give the aid to resistance groups. Everybody agrees to that. Now, they're very careful on the last phase. They simply say the final phase is we'll return to Europe. And maybe because they know that there's a potential problem with Singapore, they're very careful on the first day of the conference. They don't say anything about the Far East except we'll dedicate minimal resources to the war against Japan. And they let it go at that. And that blueprint, which is just a broad strategic, guideline, is probably the best they could agree to. That was the first meeting, the first day. That's just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. The problem is that historians criticize it because of what happens in the 5 months after the conference. There's a different interpretation by both the British and the Americans about the invasion of Europe or the return to Europe. The British think of it as a war of endurance. They're going to rely on air power, rely on sea power, and they're going to conduct operations on the margin, minimize loss of Allied lives. The Americans sort of acquiesced, but General Marshall, he interpreted the strategy as culminating in a return to northern France and the destruction of the German army. The full extent of this difference never manifests itself in the conference. It never even comes up. Everybody's happy that they've got a general outline. You got to focus on the first 4 phases anyway. And so there's no discord over this. It's only after the conference when they're looking at, are we going to go to, return to France in 42, or are we going to go to, North Africa? That's when all this argument and disagreement comes up, but that's all after the fact.
One of the most fascinating sections in the book is Christmas Eve, 1941, Roosevelt, Churchill at the White House together. probably over some cigarettes, cigars, and Johnny Walker Black,
You got it.
start talking to each other, and off the fly, Roosevelt commits American forces, or at least hints that American forces might be available. What did Roosevelt do, kind of off the cuff, that caused so much consternation at that little
I mean,
chit
this
chat?
this practically this causes all sorts of problems, but a lot of good comes out of it. It's Christmas Eve, and Churchill stays at the White House during the course of the conference. He lives there. So it's Christmas Eve. They've done their speeches. They've had dinner. Churchill and Roosevelt are alone drinking. And the key thing I keep emphasizing is they're alone. Now, Stimson and Hopkins want to make sure there's always somebody in the room, because they didn't want Roosevelt to agree to something. You know, they were afraid that Churchill was going to cajole him into something. And in fairness to Churchill, that wasn't his fault. That's what happens now. So they're there and they're drinking, and a telegram comes in from Churchill, and it's from his commander in chief in the Far East, and he needs reinforcements for Singapore. You know, to this day, nobody knows why Roosevelt said it. Roosevelt makes this off the cuff comment, you know, well, since there's slim hope of the reinforcements now en route from America breaking through the Japanese blockade of the Philippines, maybe they could be diverted elsewhere in Asia in the interest of cooperation. Off the cuff remark. Well, Churchill seizes on that, and he calls somebody in and he dictates a message that the chiefs of staff of both countries the following day at the second conference, or the second meeting of the conference on Christmas Day, will discuss diverting resources from the Philippines to Singapore. Basically, writing off the Philippines, and US resources that were going to go to the Philippines are now going to go to Singapore. Well, the next day, when the American chiefs wake up, they've got this message. Today, you're going to discuss, you know, basically abandoning the Philippines and diverting resources to Singapore. And I mean, they're apoplectic. So the head of the Army, General Marshall, the head of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Arnold, and the War Department's Far East desk officer, senior officer, a brigadier general named Dwight Eisenhower. The three of them go to see Secretary of War Henry Stimson. And I mean, they're upset. And, you know, they come to him, they've got this message, they hand it to him and go, what's going on? And Stimson looks at him like, you know, he didn't know anything. He was home with his wife on Christmas Eve. He had no idea what happened. And he looks at it and he's upset and he says, well, look, you guys go to church, because there's a church service with Roosevelt, Churchill, and their British counterparts. He said, you go to the church service with the president and the prime minister, and this is my job, I'll handle it. And he dismisses them, they go away. He reads this thing, and the more he reads it, the madder he gets. So he gets on the phone and he calls Harry Hopkins, the president's special advisor. Hopkins is always in the know. Nothing happens with Roosevelt that Hopkins doesn't know about, except it was Christmas Eve and Hopkins wasn't in the room. So Stimson says, what's going on? I mean, he can't believe it. Roosevelt is the consummate politician. The front page of every newspaper is talking about the heroic defense in the Philippines. How can you just suddenly, you know, he's just, you know, Stimson seeing the headlines, you know, America abandons Philippines, you know, he just can't figure out what's Roosevelt doing? Where's this coming from? So he confronts Hopkins over the phone. Hopkins says, I don't know what you're talking about. Let me go talk to the president. So he goes to see the president. And Marshall said that the president, you know, when he was kind of dismissive, he had what he called the cigarette flick, and he would take his cigarette and he'd flick it. And that's what he does to Hopkins. Hopkins goes in and said, what's this about us abandoning the Philippines and giving everything to the Singapore? And, you know, Hopkins and Roosevelt gives him the flick and he says, oh, no, I don't know what you're talking about. So Hopkins goes back, he gets on the phone and he tells Stimson, you got it wrong. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. Then Stimson reads the memo to him, word for word, the directions that Churchill had dictated the night before. And then Stimson says, and you can tell the president, if this is what he's going to do, he's got my resignation as Secretary of War. So Hopkins goes back to see the president. And this time, he's a little more forceful. He goes in there and says, hey, what did you do? Now, this time, Roosevelt's, he takes a lot more serious, and it's like, yeah, no, we can't abandon the Philippines. We'll have a special meeting tonight, just the American chiefs. We'll talk about it. But no, we're not going to do that. Whatever support was supposed to go to the Philippines, it's going to go to the Philippines. We're not diverting anything. The problem with that was that all that took time. They went to the church service, and then Stimson talks to Hopkins, who talks to Roosevelt, who goes back to Hopkins, who then goes back to Stimson. They go back and forth. All that takes time. And while that's going on, the British and American chiefs meet for the second time. And it's day one to day two is totally different. It's a much frostier atmosphere, much tenser feeling in the room. And, the British had to have been embarrassed by this. I mean, they certainly weren't going to abandon Singapore and give all their resources to the Philippines. And, this isn't the way you build trust and confidence. This is a fledgling alliance. The war's only on 2 weeks, and they're doing this. But, Churchill wanted it. And so Portal gamely opens the second meeting with, what resources do you have going to the Philippines, and how soon can we get them to Singapore? And that's when, this is what grows out of this is the unity of command concept. But after the war, when everybody's interviewed, the one dominant personality in the American and British chiefs is Marshall. And when you want to find out when Marshall first exerted himself, it was at the opening moments of the second meeting of the Arcadia Conference, when he cuts Portal off and says no.
Well, that's my next question is you start to get into George C. Marshall in the book, and he had a significant role and brought up this idea of a unified command. Can you tell us what that means and why that was significant?
Yeah. Marshall realizes that, it's not support to either the central focus of this, the issue is not support to the Philippines or to Singapore. Finite resources compel a unified plan and unified command structure to ensure that the Allies can use resources effectively and efficiently. He had to resolve the divisiveness, because so long as it festered, the Anglo-American allies would never be able to agree on a Far East strategy. Churchill was pursuing a short-term logistics solution that was favorable to Britain. Marshall wanted the Allies to develop an organization capable of planning, coordinating, and working together through the long war. Marshall found the British approach way too narrow. He didn't want to micromanage the air, sea, and land forces of multiple nations from afar. Marshall introduces the idea of a unified command within a designated theater. There would be a single theater commander with direct knowledge of the situation who could allocate finite resources within his theater. It would be the involvement of multiple levels of command would simply compel Marshall to referee endless food fights over resources. And he was loath to do that. These recommendations, though, for a single theater command, it was unprecedented. I mean, and it cut to the heart of the issue. Field commanders all have localitis. Wherever they are is the most important place in the world. So all the resources should come to them. And you got to remember, you got the Americans there, you got the British there, you got the Australians, and you got the Dutch. And each of them has their own Army, Navy, and Air Force calling for resources. So you have 12 separate agencies screaming that they should get everything. And Marshall didn't want to be the guy trying to divvy up what went where. He wanted one person to control the whole theater, and there would be a coherent strategy, and then he'd divide up the resources as best suited that strategy. But this unprecedented because, never have the Army, Navy, and Air Forces of multiple countries been fused under a single commander. And the American Army and Navy had never subordinated service rivalries to operate under a single commander.
So, in addition to that decision and that approach, you also say that the conference's other significant accomplishment was the creation of the combined chiefs of staff. Can you tell
Yes.
us more about that and what was
Yeah.
significant about that?
Yeah. I should say, back on unity of command, that when Marshall brings the idea up, it doesn't go over well. He hadn't time to prep everybody. And so, he's sort of the lone wolf when he brings it up. The American Navy doesn't like it. The British don't like it. Churchill hates it. But the one person who does like it is Roosevelt. Roosevelt felt that the problem at Pearl Harbor was there was no single commander. The Army was responsible for the defense of the Hawaiian Islands. The Navy was responsible for the defense of the fleet. And due to lack of coordination, this is Roosevelt's view, we have a disaster. He's never going to be in that position again. So over the next few days, the way they sell it is really Roosevelt talks to the Navy. Marshall talks to the British chiefs of staff. And then in a knockdown, drag out, one-on-one discussion, which is humorous after the fact, between Churchill and Marshall, in which Marshall was toe-to-toe with Churchill. He convinces Churchill, of the efficacy of the concept. But then who's going to control or give guidance to these theater commanders? And what they decide to do is they're looking for a way to collaborate long-term. Collaboration between two or more nations is combined. They use the term. And the Organization for Strategic Coordination between the American and British service chiefs was the combined chiefs of staff. What the British offer to do, the British become impressed to get behind the theater commander concept. What the British do is they put a mission in Washington, D.C., and it's got a senior Army, Navy, and Air Force officer. And on top of it, to head up the British mission will be Field Marshal Dill. This British mission will coordinate with the British chiefs back in London and will work on a day-to-day basis with the American chiefs in Washington, D.C. So basically, they'll run the day-to-day operations of the war out of Washington. But if there's ever a need for a change in strategy, or if there's a major decision that needs to be made, then the American and British chiefs, as well as Roosevelt and Churchill, will meet face to face and they'll hash it out. And that's basically what happens with the creation of the combined chiefs of staff. Initially, Churchill said after the conference that the most important decision or outcome of the conference was the creation of the decision for Europe first, Germany first. But later he said that he thought that the most important decision of the conference was the creation of the combined chiefs of staff. It was its most lasting and valuable contribution.
Sure. So you also note one of the other critical outcomes of this conference was the creation of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff to formulate U.S. strategy during the World War II. Why was that so important? And is this the same entity that we still have today?
It is. It's the same one that exists to this very day. The British had their Chief of Staff Committee. And so they had the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and they coordinated with each other, and they were able to provide a united front. Marshall sought to create an organization that could mirror the British Chiefs of Staff Committee, a forum where the American chiefs could meet. And so he says, what we'll do is, even though you have to remember at that time, the Air Force was part of the Army. But on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he says, General Arnold, the head of the Air Force, he's an equal member. His vote is equal to mine. He should be on it. And initially, they have 4 members. and this is something I talk about in the book. The four members are General Marshall, General Arnold, Admiral Stark, and Admiral King. During the conference, it becomes apparent that the president has lost confidence in Admiral Stark. More and more, he turns to Admiral King for advice on naval issues. And so shortly after the conference, Admiral Stark goes to Europe, and King becomes the chief of naval operations. And what they had to do is they had to have an organization where the Americans could coordinate with each other. And, they had to be able to give advice to the president, but they also had to be able to give it a united front. The Army and Navy couldn't argue with each other, while the British had a united front. And it caused a major shift in coordination and cooperation between the Army and Navy. Now, I'm not saying that feuding and petty jealousy and inter-service rivalry vanished overnight, but the new organization did force the American military services to integrate planning, intelligence, and resource requirements. I'll give you an example of this lack of coordination between the Army and Navy, and I talk about it in the book. War Plan Orange. What was supposed to happen in the Philippines? In the Philippines, the Army was supposed to deny the Japanese the use of Manila Harbor for 6 months. Then the Navy was supposed to come and rescue them. But in the Navy plan, the Navy couldn't arrive for 2 years. So it was this kind of disconnect between the Army and the Navy that, if we were going to win the war, they had to cooperate with each other and they had to coordinate with each other.
John, one more question before we get to the audience questions.
Sure.
And you emphasize this quite a bit and say that the real story of the Arcadia Conference occurred in the staff planning meetings. What was so important about those, and what was the quality of the planning of particularly the American staff planners?
The official British history kind of slams the Americans, and portrays them as, strategic amateurs. But, that's really not fair. When you look at the minutes from the meetings, the British and the American chiefs were a model of collegiality. I mean, they both bent over backwards to get along, try to see the other's perspective, and they really did try to take the high road. But when you look at the staff planning meetings, it was a totally different story. I mean, it was tough. I mean, there's a lot of staff discord, and this could be related to different military cultures and staff methodologies, but also to American Anglophobia and to British condensations, which made matters worse. The British, they viewed the Americans as naive, disorganized, and amateurish. And they did make a lot of mistakes. The staff planning at some levels was horrible. But on the other side, the Americans disdained the British arrogance as an overcompensation for a string of defeats. Why do I need to listen to you? After Crete, Norway, Greece, North Africa, France, I mean, why are you so much smarter than us? And in the meetings, when they were going at each other, things like that would get said. So, I mean, it was tough, but over time, they were able to work it out and were able to see each other's point of view. And, a lot of the basis of cooperation got worked out in the meetings between the planners over these 3 weeks. Sorry. And the quality of the work was, was very high. And I mean, they were all over the map. They were working 18-hour days, and the American staff officers, I mean, they were excellent. You have Eisenhower, Giroux, Stilwell, Wiedemeyer, Handy. The Navy had Sherman and Turner. All these guys go on to 4 stars and are household names by the end of the war. And that's the quality of the planners that are working on this. And they were all over the map. I mean, they were coordinating for Germany first. They were coordinating the various phases for the grand strategy. They they had to move troops to Australia, to Iceland, to Northern Ireland, to England, and all this was going on simultaneously. And they also had to develop plans for the Far East, which the Japanese success over the months after the conference was enormous, but the plans were well researched, well written, and they were able to adapt them.
Let me get a couple questions in here from other folks. How would you describe the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt at this conference so early and then going forward?
Actually, well, I'd say two things about it. First, the relationship was excellent. But one of the things when Churchill came over, he had a hidden agenda. He came over and he thought that, he was a good leader. He'd suffered adversity and defeat. He hadn't surrendered. He thought that he thought that he could, basically what he thought he could do is he thought he could guide Roosevelt. He wanted to defeat the Axis, but he wanted to maintain the status quo. He wanted to maintain the prestige of the British Empire. So to do that, what he had to do was because he viewed himself as, to be honest with you, he had enormous confidence in his strategic abilities. He thought that he could guide Roosevelt on the appropriate strategic objectives and resource allocation. And as the conference wore on, he found that Roosevelt had his own vision. He wouldn't be easily guided. He listened to American advisors, principally, Marshall being a very important one. But they really developed a very solid relationship and a friendship because they really didn't know each other well before. The first time they met was there was one time when they had met back right after World War I. They'd been at a dinner party and they had met briefly. Churchill didn't even remember it, and Roosevelt didn't remember it fondly. But this was the first time they actually got to stay there. Churchill stayed at the White House. Every night after the conferences, they would sit down and talk. They had meetings, and this is where they built their rapport. And this really did last throughout the war. This really established them well.
Okay, another question from our audience. Was there any significant movement or support for a Japan first policy rather than a Germany first policy?
If you ask the press and the American public, they were all for Japan first. That was the popular approach. And it really took a certain amount of courage in December of 1941 to stand up and say, you got to look at it. And they had worked on this before the war. What's the greatest threat to the United States? If England falls, Germany's going to come after us next. First economically, then militarily. What about what's Japan going to do? Well, they're creating their sphere of influence in the Far East, but it wasn't in their planning that they were going to invade the United States. So the greater threat was Germany, but the public and the press, and this will continue for another couple of years, they want revenge.
Okay, another question. Was there any discussion at the Arcadia conference about Stalin and the Soviet Union and how that factored into everything, including Lend-Lease and how, was that a factor at all?
Well, the third phase is to keep Russia in the war, and so when they on the 26th of December, Roosevelt has a very short meeting with Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Supply that Churchill brought over with him. And Beaverbrook, I won't go through it all, but he lays out a plan and explains to the president how important it is to Britain and then also to Russia, the Lend-Lease is. But the big thing that comes out of it is Beaverbrook tells the president, take a look at your production numbers for 1942. Look at the number of tanks, planes, and guns you're planning to produce. You're planning to produce as many tanks, planes, and guns as we are. And England's a much smaller country. Now, he has no metrics. He has he's done no analysis, but off the cuff, he says, you need to, the United States is a huge country. You need to mass produce tanks, guns, and planes. And this resonates with the president. And so on the 6th of January, he announces numbers for production in 42 and 43 that are staggering. By 43, we will outproduce all the Allies and Axis countries combined. And a share of that is to go to Russia.
So including Roosevelt, was there any concern in the U.S. that part of Churchill's plan was to maintain the British Empire and the Commonwealth, and was there any resistance to that?
They were aware of it, and Secretary Stimson was very aware of it, but it didn't derail anything. This was something that becomes an issue at times after the conference over, but during the course of the conference. Now, the only thing the one time something comes up is the Munitions Assignments Board. And Churchill and Beaverbrook come up with a plan that they'll have a Munitions Assignments Board that allocates resources. And basically, the board would be in both Washington and London. It would have broad powers. It would report to the president and to the prime minister, and it would be independent of the combined chiefs of staff. And this is a really funny thing that happens right before the second to last meeting. The British chiefs, flying under the cover of the Americans, insert a paragraph in there about the allocation of resources in a board. It had to report to the combined chiefs of staff. They wanted it in writing. And of course, the Americans wanted that anyway, so, sure, they stuck that in there. Churchill and Beaverbrook give this plan for Munitions Assignments Board to Roosevelt and expect him to sign up for it before they left. But after the last meeting between the American and British chiefs, as they're going into the very last meeting, this is ending everything. There's going to be a meeting with all the American and British chiefs, Churchill and Roosevelt. Right before that meeting, Roosevelt calls Marshall into his office, and he brings Hopkins with him. He made sure he always had somebody in the room after that, so he didn't sign up for something that was going to cause him problems later. And he shows the proposal to Marshall and asks him, what do you think? Marshall reads it. He goes, this is a recipe for disaster. You can't do this. Mr. President, if you do this, resources and strategy have to be linked. You can't create a board that's independent of the combined chiefs of staff. That means if Churchill doesn't like the strategy, he just won't allocate any resources to the operation. You can't do that. And so the president looks at that and he goes, okay. And he asks Hopkins what he thinks. He goes, he's right. They are linked. You can't have them independent of each other. And then Marshall tells the president, look, Mr. President, you can do whatever you want, but if you sign up for this Munitions Assignments Board like this, and it's independent of the combined chiefs of staff, I have to resign as chief of staff of the Army. So Roosevelt goes, okay, we won't do the Munitions Assignments Board then. Not like this. They do create one, but it does report to the combined chiefs of staff. But at that very last meeting in a public forum, Roosevelt tells Churchill he's not going to do it. He's not signing up for the proposal. Churchill's very upset. He's frustrated. And he tries to argue. And the president takes the high road. He's not going to argue with the prime minister in a public forum. He just lets Marshall do all the arguing. And Churchill finally acquiesces. He said, all right, we'll give it a trial run. And that's what they do.
So we have one last question. The unity of command and the combined chiefs, how was that different from how the Americans, the British, and the French operated in World War I?
It was more of a, I'm not as good as that on that as I should be, so I don't want to speak off the cuff. I know that it was more of a committee. There wasn't one single person in charge, and all resources weren't allocated by one single theater commander and his staff. It was sort of more, still had more of a committee feel about it. Whereas the theater command concept, there was one person in charge. And, they do an experiment coming out of the conference. They do the ABDA, American, British, Dutch, Australia, and command, and it doesn't last long. But they learn a lot of lessons from it, and that's why they use it throughout the rest of the war.
John Shortal, author of Codename Arcadia, thank you for being with us tonight and giving some of your time. Congratulations on the publication of the book. It's excellent. And I'm glad you've kind of filled in that hole for us in the knowledge and of one of the early conferences. I want to thank our audience for participating, our producer Liz for her efforts tonight, which are always excellent. And of course, John Shortal, we again thank you very much and wish you the best. And we appreciate you being with us.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we look forward to having you with us at a future program at the National Army Museum. And with that, we will sign off and thank you for your participation.